Good evening, everyone. My name is Autumn Johnson, and I'm going to discuss the impact of the marriage of John Adams and Abigail Adams in the American Revolution for my research project for this course. Um, the relationship between John and Abigail Adams is arguably the most important factor or the most impactful factor in John Adams's involvement in the American Revolution. Their relationship was so strong and personal that it defied societal standards for that time. Although they were both very religious and conservative, um, and their marriage was ultimately beneficial to the standing of both of their families. It turned out to be a love match, one of the most famous love matches in American history. Um, Unlike many men in the colonial era, John Adams relied heavily upon the advice and counsel of Abigail throughout his life. Um, Letters from Abigail Smith Adams on ouramericanrevolution.org show the intimacy in their relationship, the way that they talked about current events that were going on, specifically with regards to the building up of the revolution and eventually the revolution that broke out. These letters are also discussed in great deal in um, Edith Bell Gill's novel Abigail Adams Letters, which was published in 2016. The letters of John Adams specifically are discussed in Charles Francis Adams' letters of John Adams addressed to his wife. Um, in this book, specifically goes through the letters of John Adams that he wrote to Abigail and discusses what they were talking about during this time, what was going on. It really comes to show how much he relied on her. He sought out her advice constantly. He asked for her counsel, what she thought about things, how she thought that certain things would impact their children. Um, and this can be seen in multiple different sources that I've compiled for my project. Specifically have the letters. I went to the primary sources for most of that. Margaret Hogan, James Taylor, and Joseph Ellis have a book called My Dearest Friend, Letters of Abigail and John Adams, and that also has a compilation of letters, but specifically addresses what the Adams' lives were like before and after their marriage, who they were as people, how their personalities went on to affect their marriage, and later involvement in the American Revolution. Um, Natalie Bober's book called Abigail Adams' Witness to a Revolution really talks about the historicity of Abigail Adams and just how supportive she was of the American Revolution. She encouraged her husband. Her personal contributions helped lead the American colonial cause to victory in the advisement of her husband. She not only advised her husband John Adams, but she also advised George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. She kept a frequent correspondence with all of these men, and not only offered her thoughts and her prayers, but also gave them counsel on how to proceed from the perspective of a sensitive, womanly figure who had a perspective that the men who were involved in the American Revolution might not have had without her. Um, Another source that I used for letters were Kat Eschner's book called The Letters of Abigail and John Adams that show their mutual respect towards one another. These are more affectionate letters that talk about the respect that they have for one another, the love that they have for one another. And it truly goes to show how Abigail and John Adams viewed each other as equals. John Adams did not just view his wife as a homemaker, as most of the colonial men did during this time. He viewed her as his partner, as his equal, as his confidant, as the person that he heavily relied on all throughout his life. Um, there was no person who understood him better. There was no person who knew him better than Abigail Adams, and vice versa. And so this source really goes to discuss the importance of their personal relationship on the trust that would build throughout their life. I also used some biographical sources on Abigail Adams to help provide for just the historicity of her life. Um, the First Lady biography on Abigail Adams on the National First Ladies Library. I used some biographies on John Adams, specifically the biographies by David McCullough called John Adams, Barbara Bennett Peterson called John Adams, the founder of the American political tradition, um, and John Adams, A Life by John E. Fairling. Um, it was a bit difficult researching this project to sort of hone in on their relationship and how it affected the American Revolution. Luckily, the Adams marriage is well documented. Um, a lot of their letters have survived, and despite the distance at the time, they were able to stay in constant contact. I was also able to find letters back and forth from Abigail Adams to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Um, and that was also very helpful. Um, Abigail Adams' role in the American Revolution really defied gender roles. For that time, most women, typically in the colonial era, sort of went along with what their husbands did. And Abigail Adams was not that way. If there was something that she believed that John Adams was doing that she didn't like, if there was something she disapproved of, if there was something that she uh, emphatically disagreed with, he knew about it. And she discussed with him his movements from when he represented um, the British soldiers early on. She recognized that even though um, they had a personal stake in the revolution, and even though she supported the revolution, she also constantly reminded her husband to be a fair and virtuous man, a man worthy of the faith that he held. Now, Abigail Adams believed in the revolution. She believed in freedom from a tyrannical government thousands of miles away, an ocean away. And she believed in men like George Washington. She believed in men like John Adams, her husband, of course, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. She believed in their cause. It wasn't just something that she held on to because her husband um, was so prominent in the American Revolution and the founding of the independent American nation. She believed in it personally. She believed in it for her children. Uh, in her letters, she discusses the impact that the revolution will have on future generations. And she was undoubtedly thinking of her children and future grandchildren here. Um, and I think she realized that this wasn't something that was just going to be swept under the rugs of history. This was something, the American Revolution was something that was going to change the world forever. And I think she reminded her husband of that. She reminded George Washington of that. She reminded Thomas Jefferson of that. And really just encouraged them to stick to their principles, regardless in the politicking that followed the American Revolution and the founding of America with the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. She was worried that even after the colonies had broken away and founded their own nation, she was hesitant and worried that they would be back in the same place they were before, under a tyrannical government, but an American tyrannical government. And so she was cautious to encourage the founders to hold fast to the beliefs that they had prior to the American Revolution and to hold fast to the beliefs that they had during the Revolution, not to give up on that just because they had won. And I think that Abigail Adams' strength, her tenacity, her boldness to speak her mind, whenever to whoever, was a large, and I'm not sure it can be um, put into words how big of a factor she was um, to the success of the American Revolution and the subsequent founding. Without her, I don't think we would see the same John Adams that we know in history today as a man who, was probably wrong on some issues, but ultimately stood up for his principles, stood up for his beliefs, and was an excellent and fair attorney. And I certainly don't think we would have the presidency of John Quincy Adams. He became the man that he was because he had two strong, loving parents um, who were willing to step across societal lines, who were willing to fight for what they believed in. And I think that that was seen in later generations, and I think that's a large part of why um, America is what it is today in terms of our freedoms, is because we had men and women like Abigail Adams, John Adams, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison who were willing to stand up for what they believed in.